Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Mind the Planet, a multi perspective podcast where we explore mental and planetary health through conversations with experts from diverse fields and backgrounds. So, today we have an amazing guest, Dr. Amjad Saleem. He's a practitioner and a scholar, a lot of work in peace building, interfaith engagement, humanitarian policy. He has a focus on South Asia, and he particularly looks at the role that faith leaders can play in peace building and conflict resolution. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Saleem. Thank you for being here today.
No, thank you for inviting me, Vildan. It's a great honor for me to be here. Thank you.
I just want to start with an introduction into you first. And my first question would be, how do you define yourself beyond professional or societal titles, which I just introduced in brief right then, but what core values anchor your sense of identity? So, any personal stories that will illustrate simplicity and humility, and also how your values shape your worldview. I would love to hear about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. It actually made me sort of sit back and think, how do I describe myself? I think first and foremost, very confused was one. I'm a third culture kid. I was born, my parents are from one country. I was born in another country. I grew up in another country. So I have all these different experiences that have influenced me, right? So that made me who I am. But if you ask me, like, who are you? Like, what is your identity? It's often very difficult. So I would sort of say I'm British Sri Lankan because that's where I am, but I consider home where I am in these things. But I grew up in Nigeria, I grew up in Ethiopia. I've lived in Switzerland for a while, so I have all these different influences that are there. But I think, titles are describe what we do, but they rarely capture who we are. So I'd like to consider myself primarily, I'm a seeker. I'm a seeker of knowledge. I'm a seeker of truth. I'm a servant. I'm a bridge builder. I'm a catalyst. I like to consider myself a community catalyst. And I think what really anchors me in terms of that perspective is really values that have been influenced effectively from where I've grown up. In terms of my experience, obviously my faith is a key component of that. My family, and that is the values of dignity, the values of human dignity, the values of respecting the diversity that we have in the world, the concept of service, the concept of humility, and the concept of responsibility towards others. I think that's something that really kind of grounds me in that perspective. And then as part of that perspective, I've also sort of had an orientation, particularly over the last few years, in terms of trying to change the mindset of not necessarily looking at problems per se. Because if we just look at problems, we end up going down this rabbit hole of never-ending problems, right? But looking at possibilities and potential. And I think this is something that I've learned to appreciate a lot more in terms of recognizing the strengths that exist in people and communities. And so just trying to kind of navigate that space, because obviously we're presented with different tensions between ideals and reality, between generations, between institutions, between people. And so, these tensions are not necessarily bad or destructive, but I think if we can see them as potentials, as sources of energy for transformation, I think we can start to look at something a little bit better. So, I mean, I think these are some of the things that have defined who I have become today. But that's not to say that they will, because I always also see this as a journey, right? So I've picked this up. And so these are things that and that's why I call myself a seeker, that I'm seeking this knowledge, and then I add them to my portfolio, and then I move on. And so, if you ask me this, maybe you ask me the same question, maybe 2 years from now, I might have a different perspective, because I've had different experiences and I've met different people, and they've helped me to kind of shape that a little bit, or sharpen it a little bit more.
That was really Insightful. Thank you so much. And looking into looking into solutions rather than problems also resonates a lot because especially with something like the climate crisis, for example, there's so many different aspects. So if you dive into it in terms of a negative, more pessimistic view, it's never going to stop, disappointing you or just bringing kind of fear into your life. But you did say something very interesting I wanted to follow up on, which was that you grew up in a few different countries. You're kind of a three-country person in terms of where you grew up, where you were born, where your parents are from. Do you think that kind of international perspective has shaped your work, kind of what you do, what you strive towards?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think that the mere fact that I grew up in Nigeria, I grew up in Ethiopia, I had friends from different parts of the world, from different faith communities. That has, I think, made me more sensitive to diversity, right? The diversity for the diversity of thought, the diversity of practice, the diversity of culture, even the diversity of religion, right? I mean, the mere fact that I grew up very early on in my childhood. I was exposed to people from Senegal, from Mali, from Nigeria, from Ethiopia, from Mauritius, from India. So, and some of them were Muslim, and so you had different expressions of Islam, which was quite interesting, right? And so, to a large extent, it got me appreciating that diversity and understanding that as well. It also made me much more conscious to conflict. I would sort of say conflict in the sense of people coming from different parts of the world. I mean, I grew up in Ethiopia at a time when there was a civil war there, right? So I actually grew up at the end. I was there when the civil war ended and everything else. So you could see Ethiopia transitioning from what it was before to what it has become, and so I think you get a better sense of and a better appreciation of your privilege to and ability to kind of sympathize and empathize with people, but also to be able to contribute back. And I think this is what ultimately I do think did influence me. Although I wouldn't sort of say that. I mean, in hindsight now, I think it's like I said, it's part of my journey that I've come to appreciate, right? But at that time, it was just I'd grown up and I knew all these things. But I think it's now looking back on it, looking how I deal with people, I think it's really been that influence. And so it also made me realize that you can only when you get to know people and when you get to understand where they come from, you might be able to respect and accept them. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to agree with them, but you can create a space for respect and understanding. But that only comes when you humanize someone and when you actually get to know who they are. Because if you start from this person is bad, but I've never met that person, I don't know anything about that person, I don't know anything about their culture or their religion or everything else, you actually have you're starting from a point of ignorance.
That is really interesting. And, I do think cultivating that respect, cultivating that knowledge of other people is really sometimes absent in our world today, in our normal everyday interactions, but really crucial. And, with this kind of multi-perspective viewpoint or perspective, meeting people from other countries, I wanted to ask you from your perspective, what shared themes have you seen across these different faiths, different practices of Islam, different religions altogether, and cultural traditions. So, especially we had touched on, kind of simplicity and humility before. So, what's kind of that shared values across cultures?
I think one of the values that came across that has resonated a lot is the concept of compassion, right? The fact that I think deep down we all want to be treated or we all want to be respected when someone treats us. So if we want to be that, we need to treat someone as we wish to be treated, right? And so I think that aspect of compassion has been something that has resonated quite strongly. Also the concept of kindness. And I think in this day and age, kindness is seen as it's a negative word, right? I mean, it's a very weak word. It's if you're kind, you're not seen to be strong. People think that they can take advantage of you because you're kind, but actually, kindness in its entirety is about how you welcome the stranger, how you interact with someone, how you respect, how you respect your elders, how you how you interact with people, uh, of your own age or all the things like that. And I think, one thing that I learned very is the aspect of just being kind because you are seeing the humanity in the other person, right? And you would want to be treated, so you would treat that person as you would want to be treated. And so if you want to be treated with kindness and you'd want to be treated with respect, you would offer uh, the same sort of treatment to someone else. I think those are some things that have resonated with me over the last few years. And I mean, I think as well, look, when I grew up, particularly in Nigeria and Ethiopia, I mean, this was like the prehistoric ages, right? So there was no internet, there was no sort of thing. So, a lot of times we actually spent outside. Physical interactions were much greater, and you really got to understand people's culture. And there was this aspect of your respect for people's culture, right? Your respect for people, where people came from, because there was that appreciation that you brought something different to that, and that understanding that diversity in its entirety is actually not a bad thing. It's actually quite positive. That diversity is a positive disruption because you get different ideas coming and you're able to kind of bring that together. But that, like I said, was a lot more of a simpler time. But I really think that what, and particularly, I think was interesting to grow up in Ethiopia, right? Because Ethiopia was this really fascinating country. They're Orthodox Christians, so very, some of their practices are extremely close with Islam. Islam has a very long history in Ethiopia. It was a place where the first refugees actually went to, right, from Mecca. They escaped persecution. They went to Ethiopia, and they found similarities there because of Islam and Christianity. But Ethiopia is also a country that was not colonized, right? One of the very few countries in the world, and even Africa, that was not colonized. And so there's a deep sense of pride in that uh, in that perspective, and so they view life differently. And I think that was quite interesting because obviously coming from a country that was colonized, my parents are Sri Lankan, and so coming there, it was interesting to kind of see how they viewed history and how we viewed history, and so this understanding then that you could have two different versions of history, but somewhere in between is an element of truth, and it's important for you to dig deep to understand that you don't have the full version of stuff.
Yeah, and those are really interesting values I think that you've seen across cultures, and your perspective makes everything a lot more insightful. But trying to emulate these same values, these same kind of things that we hold, like simplicity, you mentioned that compassion. What challenges arise when we try to emulate these in our daily lives now, when our society is so shaped by consumption, excess? You had said before, kindness is now viewed as kind of a weakness, like you're easily exploitable. So, what challenges do you think arise in these types of situations?
I mean, I think the challenge. So I mean, the two ones that I hold very very dear to me, particularly is this aspect of humility and even simplicity, as you said, right? And I think that and I take a lot from my late father, who really taught me about quiet humility, right? And it's it's tough because he never defined success by recognition or status, right? He always sort of belief that if you truly serve others, you do not need to push yourself forward. The work itself will speak. And in this day and age where you're trying to find the how many likes you have and how many people of times your posts have been reposted. I mean, I think it requires a discipline to be able to continuously remind yourself that never to think that you are different from others and that you expect special treatment, right? And I think that is a challenge, and we are increasingly challenged by that because again, humility is seen as a weakness. Humility is seen as something that, oh, okay, there we have to talk about ourselves, and if you're not the loudest voice in the room, you're not going to be heard. And I think what we need to do is just figure out ways of understanding how we can quietly influence those folks. But for me, humility becomes the foundation for human dignity. Simplicity, of course, is another challenge because we, as you've rightly pointed out, we live in a culture that constantly encourages consumption and excess and accumulation. My father would always sort of say, he had a very simple example on this, right? You'd ask, why would someone need a $200,000 car if a $10,000 car would serve the same function, right? So his point was not about judging wealth, but it was whether the surplus could be used instead to help others. And again, that's a discipline that one needs to cultivate. But what I've learned, and you can imagine, right, as a kid sort of looking and sort of saying, well, why don't you have a $200,000 car? You should have the $200,000 car. And then sort of now realizing that actually that discipline is actually something much more deeply spiritual about this. It's a sense of inner tranquility and groundedness in yourself, that you know what your self-worth is. That's a huge strength, right? That you are strong in your own self-being. And this is not being arrogant. So it's still being humble, but being strong in your self-being, that you know that I can resist this, and I can sort of take these things forward. And so that inner peace is important to cultivate, right? And to keep on cultivating, because it's not something you can sort of get and then sort of say, I've got inner peace and that's it. You have to keep on cultivating that. So I guess, from my perspective, what I've come to learn is simplicity is not about deprivation. I think we need to be very clear on that, right? I mean, it's not about that. It is about saying or rediscovering enoughness, if that's a word. That it's enough. I've got it. I don't need anything more than that, right? I've got everything there. And so what that means is that you then develop that inner strength to connect with what truly matters, whether it's relationships with family, with your friends, with your community, responsibility to others, to the planet, all of those things. It allows you to kind of say, it's enough. I can do what this is enough for me. I don't need that extra thing. And I think that's something that I've learned, right? And I keep on learning, because it's, like I said, it's a daily struggle.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think simplicity and humility, they're very absent in our world oftentimes, but can really cultivate, our sense of well-being, our sense of stability and strength in ourselves. And I think that, enoughness is such a good word, because right now we have a loss of the sense of enough. And, conversely, all simplicity and humility benefit ourselves, but how does excess, so especially environmental excess, extractivism, trying to take all the resources that we can from our earth, how does that harm both the human mind and then also our planet? Because you also mentioned that, this sense of simplicity, humility, grounding yourself can help you actually do more in your responsibilities towards the planet. So how does this excess, this loss of the sense of enough, harm both ourselves and the planet? And also maybe you could discuss climate grief and eco-anxiety as well.
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting question, right? I mean, I think um, you know, and I like this word called what do you call it, ecological grief,
Mm-hmm.
because it's very interesting because um, one of the things that we're actually very bad as, I mean, we're it's slightly better in some parts of the world, but in many parts of the world, we're not very good at, is processing grief, right? And not even processing, acknowledging grief. And certain cultures also do that. So, if you, um, I mean, whether it's an Islamic culture or whether it's a South Asian culture or whatever, grief is not something that you publicly acknowledge, and it also has a gendered lens as well, right? So I learned, for example, when my father passed away, I was told very categorically that you as the male of the family now, you cannot show your grief in public, right? Because you have to deal with all of these things. And I was like, well, what do you mean? I need to process my grief, right? But it was expected that I would not show my grief, and I would have to kind of deal with it, because my mom was there or whatever. So grief is something very, very interesting. And then now bring the aspect of ecological grief into that, and I think you're now getting into a place where people don't necessarily then know, they can't make the connection. One, because ecology is still very, very abstract, right? In that sense, or climate change is still very, very abstract. And so the ecological grief becomes sort of, I think, a little bit, a lot more abstract. And so I think we need to kind of understand this a lot more. But I think, processing that grief is probably the same as processing any grief, right? Which is, we need to be able to have that space for spiritual reflection. We need to be able to have that space for connection to each other, to nature, connection back to nature. The aspect of storytelling, the aspect of uh, collective action. And so, I think one of the things that, and I come from having worked um, in humanitarian response, and often you find in times of big disasters, um, when people who have suffered a big disaster themselves, right? Often they become volunteers to help others because they have a shared purpose, right? And so grief can also become a catalyst for renewal rather than paralysis. And so they can channel that grief into something better, not to help them forget, but to help them sort of uh, process it by helping someone else, right? And so you kind of process your grief that way. And so maybe I think part of that processing of the ecological grief, I think we need to create those opportunities for us to come around a shared purpose, and helping communities and both religious and others to kind of understand what that shared purpose is. Um, and I think there still needs to be a lot more narrative in that space. And unfortunately, I think we are missing opportunities here. We're missing opportunities about sharing, about discussing that shared space. Again, because we have forgotten the aspect of simplicity. We've forgotten the aspect of the spiritual teachings around excess, and why it's bad and all of those things, and the balance, and maintaining a balance. So I think that it's something there that I think we probably need to come back to, both at the spiritual leadership level, but also at community level. And this is, I think, something that that we are constantly being challenged on, because people are wanting those solutions. Young people are wanting those solutions, but they're not getting them.
I definitely agree. I think also the point about, turning this kind of ecological grief, you can turn into a catalyst for action. There's this whole concept of turning eco-anxiety into eco-action, which is really fascinating as well. But what role do you think spiritual leaders can play? Because you mentioned, fostering these conversations, fostering the sense of shared purpose, bringing people together in a community, addressing eco-anxiety, fostering hope. What role do you think spiritual leaders across faiths can play in this?
Well, I think one of the things that I think, so ironically, one of the things that unites all the faiths, regardless of what faith there is this aspect of environmental stewardship. Is there somewhere within any of these teachings um, is uh, something around caring for planet, caring for Mother Earth, caring for the nature, caring for animals, all of those things. It's manifested itself in different perspectives. So, for example, within the Islamic perspective, human beings are described as the Khalifa, right? God says we've sent you, man, as the Khalifa, as a steward um, on Earth. So creation is also seen as with all these signs that invite reflection and humility. And so caring for Earth is not separate from faith. It's part of living ethically within creation, right? And I think that so ironically, I think we have that. It's just that I don't think we've fully understood that. And so a lot of particularly institutional faith that has arisen now is very much focused on, it's a numbers game, right? It's like how many people can we get to the mosques or to the temples, how many people converting, how many people are doing the rituals and the worship, but we've not inculcated the fact that caring for Earth is part of our faith. And I speak from a Muslim perspective, but I think it's very, very similar in other things, including indigenous traditions as well, right? That many indigenous traditions also express that similar understanding that land is not a commodity but a relationship. And so when you see Earth as a trust rather than property, then that stewardship and that care becomes a part of that responsibility that you have, right? So I think part of that perspective is for faith leaders to start to recognize once again those teachings within that conversation, right? And so it's about moving beyond form to spirit, because rituals alone doesn't guarantee ethical behavior, right? It's expressed in how we treat people, communities, and the world. And so I think it's about really taking that perspective there. Now, how we do that, of course, and this is something that I think young people as well in particular are asking for. And that's why you find a lot of young people also disillusioned with what's happening in the world, obviously, but also with institutions and institutionalized religion, right? So there's this complaint that young people are no longer religious and then they're abandoning faith. And I would argue, I don't think they're abandoning faith. I think they're abandoning faith institutions, right? But they still have a sense of spirituality, a recognition of their role. But what they're seeing is they're seeing a disconnect between what they expect in terms of spiritual teachings and what is being modeled by religious institutions, religious leaders, right? And so there's an anger there. And so I think the issue that we need to kind of figure out is how do we bridge that? And one of the ways, of course, is to then look at examples where communities are already living sustainably and using these teachings and amplifying those practices there. But that takes time. But I think there has to be that mind shift, right? Mindset shift that we need to think about. And faith leaders have a role to play, because faith is for billions of people across the world, right? Faith is a lived experience for many of them. Previously I would have sort of said that it's largely only in the global south there, but judging from what I'm seeing over the last few days, it's also in the global north where faith is a lived experience. We might disagree with how faith is being expressed in places like the US, right? But ultimately, what that is showing me is that no matter how much we talk about secularism in the West and in this thing, actually faith is still a very very strong component of people's lives. And so faith leaders then have the role, and faith institutions then have the role to play, because people are look at faith and abide by faith. And so we need to have faith leaders at the table, and we need to have them kind of understanding that they have a role to play. They have a role to play in terms of encouraging from their own spiritual teachings, environmental stewardship, but also recognizing that our role, our spiritual role, when we see the earth as a trust, that our spiritual responsibility is to care for the earth and for the people that inhabit it, and obviously the other creations as well, which is animals, the plants, and all of those things. And that's part of what we need to start to inculcate.
Definitely agree. And I think this connection within so many faiths and, within Islam between humans and the earth and the environment and the plants, like this is a separate thing. It's part of the religion, part of the faith itself. I think that's why so many of these religions have faith leaders doing efforts in planetary health. But I do agree that, this kind of institutionalized religion can be a big factor in, if so many faith communities, if so many different ways of life emphasize environmental stewardship, why so many people still struggle to enact that in their daily lives. And I do agree that a lot of youth are becoming kind of disillusioned with this disconnect between what they see. They read the different books of faith, different teachings, and they see that, all of these different things emphasize environmental stewardship, but then they go into their community actually and see that there's kind of a lack of this stewardship toward the planet, this care, this respect towards other living beings besides ourselves. And, how do you think we can kind of combat that, kind of start fostering hope again, get young people who are disillusioned, angry at previous generations, angry at, world leaders today? How can we begin to rebuild hope, foster hope, get them interested once more in caring for the earth and caring for themselves?
So I often talk about something called radical hope, right? And if you've sort of seen a lot of my recent writings, I've sort of started talking about radical hope. And if you look at my Instagram posts now, particularly during Ramadan, I've been kind of re-emphasizing radical hope, because I think radical hope is something that we need to kind of rediscover. And we have the spiritual teachings of that, actually. But radical hope for me is hope that is grounded in reality, but refuses to surrender to despair, right? So I think that what we need to do is that we need to understand, number one, we need to understand that youth frustration is not just about rebellion, but it's about systemic tension between the aspirations of young people and the structures that they will inherit. And I think what we need to do is create those spaces whereby we actually, number one, understand sort of how young people engage. And I often call it the 5 A's of youth engagement, right? I sort of say, I think from my perspective, I think we engage with or we should see youth engagement is through five lenses. And so one of them is as agents of change, right? They will do stuff on the ground, and they will be the ones to kind of do the things. We're seeing that across the world. But they're also architects of systems. They're also anchors of resilience. They're advocates for justice, and they're amplifiers of unheard voices. I think if we can create that space whereby we co-create with them to sort of say, these are, let's sort of look at how we solve problems. And I'm not talking about problems globally. I'm talking about problems in neighborhoods. I'm talking about problems in communities, right? Let's start there, because that's the only thing that you and I have control of, right? What you and I can do is solve what is happening in our neighborhoods. So let's start there, because that's what we have influence of. And then if we can co-create solutions together to solve those problems, and if we can allow young people to design that, be the architects of that, we know that they will amplify those voices. They know that they will be advocates for justice, and ultimately, you know, that they will do the work on the ground. I think that that's the first thing. But in order for that to happen, we also need to build trust. Right? Trust is extremely important. And one of the things that we have currently in the world is a crisis of trust. We don't trust each other. We don't trust the government. We don't trust the media. We don't even trust civil society, NGOs. So we don't trust anyone, frankly, right? And so we need to build trust. But the only way you can build trust is to start to build relationships with each other, to start to build that intergenerational relationships as well. And so we need to create those spaces to transform youth anger into collective leadership. But it needs to be within a space of trust. That requires someone to kind of go, okay, fine, let's do this. Let's start. I have to start somewhere, and I will start with that. And that's where we can start to create that space whereby young people can be given a voice. And I think that's something that unfortunately not many people are doing, because young people are the future. They're not today, so we'll let them do it tomorrow, right? They're not today. And of course, what do they know, right? They don't have any ideas. And I think that's extremely wrong, right? I often remind people that, if you ever read the fairy tales, the Grimm's fairy tales, Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale of the emperor with no clothes, right? Who was the one who pointed out that the emperor had no clothes? It was a youth. It was a young person. It was a child. Everyone else fell for that thing. It was a young person who was the advocate and the amplifier to kind of say that emperor has no clothes, right? And so I think it's important for us to understand that, but also for us to understand that young people also, again, it's very easy to say youth, but without understanding that, that's also a disrespect to young people, right? Because that assumes that young people are this homogeneous entity out there called the youth. They're not. They're all sorts of different kind of identities that are there. And so I think it's important for us to sort of create that space to have that conversation. And unfortunately, most of us, and I think this is particularly true in faith communities, right, in faith institutions, that there's no space for young people, right? Young people are not given the space to be part of any conversations. And I think we need to really flip that model. Because again, I don't think young people are saying we want to be the theological leaders. What they're saying is that we want to have collective leadership, and that's different, because a leader is not one person, right? A leader is the sort of ability to catalyze action on the ground, and I think we need to be able to kind of create that space for that.
It's really fascinating, and I really agree with the perspective you shared of, seeing youth as the 5A, so, activists, agents, acknowledging the role and not belittling them, because I do think in a lot of communities today, unfortunately, some faith communities as well, the role of young people is kind of belittled, they're kind of demeaned, like you said it, but what do you know? Like, you're too young, you can take this over in the future. So really emphasizing holding these spaces for young people to share their emotions or feelings, because I do agree that trust is really degraded in our world today. And I actually saw a study just yesterday that was about surveying different countries, and it was about if people see their neighbors as morally good. And, for example, in the US, it was the majority of people who didn't see their neighbors as morally good, so there's no trust there. But another really interesting aspect of that was, for the countries that were mentioned in the global south, or kind of out of the West, it was more people tended to view their neighbors as morally good, more people tended to have trust. So also seeing that discrepancy between different regions of the world, how these crises are playing out was super interesting. So yeah, I think it's really fascinating.
Absolutely, because the thing is that the one of the paradoxes of the current age, right, is that we have become connected. So, like, yeah, I'm speaking to you from Colombo, right? So we're connected, right? But equally, we've become disconnected, right? Because we spend more time here than we spend actually speaking to people face to face, right? And I think that what we need to kind of do, and this is where again, perhaps faith communities can maybe offer some sort of opportunities there because they possess something that sort of modern societies often lack, right? Because they possess the sense of belonging. They possess the sense of moral imagination. They possess a sense of community, right? I mean, often people are tied with their faith communities. But what they need to do is kind of bridge that. So they also need to understand that sense of community is more than um, more than just who you are. I mean, if you look at the concept of neighbors, right? I mean, within the biblical senses, you love your neighbor, right? Within the Islamic sense is that you shouldn't go to bed you shouldn't go to bed full if your neighbor is hungry, right? And there's often a tradition that says that your neighbor is not just immediate. It could be 40 houses on either side could be your neighbors. And so that aspect of knowing your neighbors, which is why I'm sort of saying it goes back to this idea that let's start with communities. Let's just start with your neighbors. Let's just start with your road, right? What is it that we can do just to get people to connect, right? Because everyone has a challenge that they're going through, and I think it's important that we get to connect that. And I think this is where faith communities and spiritual leaders in particular can have that role, right? I think acknowledge people's challenges a little bit more honestly. Nurture that community. Again, going back to community, I think community is so important nowadays. And yes, the sense of community has changed because you have people moving in and people moving out and social mobility and all of those things. But again, just going back to, okay, let's just look at who's down your road. And let's just sort that out because that's what you can do and that's what you will be held accountable for. No one's going to, from a divine perspective, you're not held responsible for things you have no control over, right? But you're held responsible for things you have control over. And I think that's the important thing that we need to come back to.
Right. So, I think the concept of community, like you said, is so crucial. Like neighbors, not just the ones on either side, but your entire road, your entire neighborhood, your entire faith community, for example. Because I do think, connecting this back to ecological grief, climate, mental health, such a big factor towards the kind of stress, dread, fear, anxiety towards the future of the planet that young people, especially, but all people feel today, is the isolation that often comes with digital age. Like you said, the paradox of, we're so much more connected, but at the same time, we're so much more disconnected. So I think fostering the sense of community is so crucial in terms of combating these negative emotions. And, talking about the different cultures' approaches to this, I mentioned that in studying, different countries had different perspectives on trust and, morals and, trusting your neighbors and community and all of that. We've been talking about how different communities don't view youth as relevant, but there are also a lot of communities that do and are actively working towards environmental justice, trying to do stewardship of the planet. So from your perspective, kind of moving towards a positive lens, what local approaches, what indigenous approaches, faith approaches do you think deserve greater recognition towards environmental justice? So, marginalized voices, overlooked traditions, those would be really valuable to explore.
Yeah, so I mean, I think again, one of the things that we haven't really understood, and again, I think it comes to how it's also a little bit of power dynamics in there. Is this aspect of indigenous traditions, right? And a lot of indigenous traditions hold deep ecological knowledge that have been developed over centuries, and that has then also been influenced spiritual teachings as well. So I think that one thing is to kind of rediscover that. Now, I think one thing that I've appreciated, particularly over the last few years, is for me as well, is to move, at least in my mind, the discussion from climate change to planetary health, right? And when I sort of made that mental leap myself, and then I started talking to faith leaders, I found that there was also a better recognition of what that meant, right? Because when you talk climate change to people went, well, people all automatically went, oh, okay, that's scientific, that's all of these things. The moment you started talking about planetary health, then people went, okay, I think we can see what you're getting at, because yes, like I said, every spiritual teaching has some kind of element about care for them, the stewardship and all of those things. So I think one thing that we need to do is shift that now. And one of the things that I think, particularly over the last few years, that has come out that has been quite useful in this is the Sunway Charter on faith action and planetary health, right? That was particularly meant to do that. That was meant to create a space for people of faith and faith communities to understand their role in addressing planetary health issues. So and not to sort of think it's something else. It's someone else's job. It's their role there to help them understand what they, from their own faith communities, can do. And you have that. I mean, we have, for example, in Sri Lanka, we have different Muslim communities, and we have one that comes from the Bora Muslim community, the Dawoodi Boras. And one of the things they've perfected over the last few years is having massive events. And I think they've had events where they've had up to 10,000 people and had zero food wastage, right? So like everything is kit, and there's absolutely no wastage of pollution or everything. Everything is cleaned, everything is recycled, everything. And when you ask them how does that come, they say, well, one is in terms of our organization, but also two, it's a directive that has come from our faith leaders that this is important. Some people are told about this. So I think that once people understand that this is part of their faith traditions, I think, and once it's emphasized from their faith leaders, then it takes, it's much more easier to be to inculcate this. And this goes back to trust, right? Because if people feel like you're credible, you're reliable, they trust you more, right? So I think what we need to do is also have faith leaders also inculcating that practice. And I think that's the key thing for us. So you do have communities that are starting to do this, and I've discovered some of them there in terms of water conservation, solar powers in mosques or in churches, ensuring that they're recycling water and all, or harvesting rainwater. I think the food wastage one is quite interesting, particularly when you have big feasts and religious this thing, right? And you have 10,000 people. Imagine, right? You have 10,000 people coming, and there's absolutely no wastage. I mean, that's amazing. But they've managed to kind of get that done. Again, that goes to the fact that they've taken it upon themselves to see this as emphasizing a relational understanding of land, collective stewardship, and that long-term responsibility. And I think that's important. I know, one of the things that they do, for example, is that they offer for those people who want to come for, and I noticed this recently, for those people who want to come for for some of the prayers that happens during Ramadan in the evenings, they offer bus services, right? So again, you don't need to, so the community will offer the bus service, so you don't need to drive your car to the mosque, right? You just get on the bus and the bus will bring you. Now, that's a great example of that. And and I know, and I think that's something that we need to inculcate more.
I think these communities have so much potential to kind of re-foster environmental stewardship. Like you said, eliminating food waste, reducing emissions, water conservation, so many different things going on. I think so many communities are already doing that, and it's really inspiring. It really gives a lot of hope to see that. And, for example, an example here in the US is Native Americans have an entire concept of cultivating the land so it's ready for the next 7 generations. Not even, today, most people don't even think about the next generation, let alone 7 generations ahead. So it's fascinating to see the different types of values, the different types of actions different communities have across the world. And with a huge humanitarian background, I think humanitarian efforts can often be a little bit more Western focused, maybe with a bit more colonialist perspective, and not really acknowledge these traditions that are already happening. So how do you think these humanitarian efforts, different, climate efforts around the world, can move beyond just survival, just, meeting the basic needs of people, to acknowledging their culture, their values, to dignity, healing and thriving, maybe holistic approaches that integrate mental health care, human rights, etc. So how do you think they can move beyond that?
So that's a really interesting question, right? I mean, I think I've often said that the current humanitarian system, it's a huge hangover from the colonial past, right? And in fact, there's a great academic in the UK called William Acker, who actually calls the Western, or he calls the humanitarian system, he calls it the grandchildren of colonial missionaries, right? Because basically what we have done is that we have just what the colonial missionaries did 200 or 300 years ago when they first came out to these countries, we have now replaced it with the same kind of mentality of patronizing help and coming out and colonialism did three things, right? It took away power, it took away economic resources, they also took away knowledge, right? So the entire worldview was shifted, right? So the worldview becomes Eurocentric or Western, and so you deliberately inhibit your own worldview because you've been brought up to think that's wrong, that's bad, everything that that's not right. So and unfortunately, many faith-based organizations, particularly Muslim-based charities, I think, also fall into the same trap because they have the same aspect of it, right? So if you look at the current humanitarian system, and it's quite interesting now because with all the funding cuts that are coming in because of what the US has initiated over the last year, and this has been followed by other governments as well, shows that it was another type of colonial control, right? That once the money goes, that's it. So I think that if we really want to shift this thing, we need to shift the power, we need to shift the knowledge, and it has to actually go back to then understanding what local communities themselves have to offer. And that's going to take time because the key thing is power. The key thing is if we shift the emphasis to local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, local action, we lose power. We lose our sense of operation. We lose our sense of identity. Right? Most of these agencies are no longer relevant, right? And the business model goes. Even though we know the business model has been broken, it's been broken. With the incidents of the last 1 year have proved that the current model which the international maritime sector was operating is a broken model. But no one has thought about doing away with the model and starting from scratch again. Everyone's sort of thinking, okay, how do we fix this, right? The car, no one sort of said we should get rid of the car. Everyone was kind of saying, okay, how do we tinker with the car so that we can still make it go, okay, it used to go 100 miles an hour. Now it's only going 20, but let's just keep it going 20 because that's what, and I think that's at some point also will need some reckoning, but it does require someone brave enough to go, actually, I can do this. But in that sense, this is where I think faith communities have an opportunity, because a lot of their funding doesn't come from governments. It comes from communities. I've been telling this about the Muslim agencies, but also other agencies, that they get money from their communities, right? They're not necessarily dependent on institutional funding, which means that they can control how they disperse their money, and they can control how they put knowledge in, and they can control what they do with it. But they're often doing the same thing because everyone thinks that that's the model to work on, without actually thinking, well, should we do something different? And I think this is where there does need to be some sort of reckoning. And I think this is where the gap is, right? That even within the international humanitarian sector, that we are doing things as a tokenistic perspective. Yeah, climate change, yes, we're greening our work and everything else. But ultimately, are we really condemning all of this? What are we doing that is really sort of shifting the dial in that process? And I don't think we are.
Fascinating. I do completely agree. I think humanitarian responses, within the climate movement itself, not only trying to get, like actual humanitarian help to disaster-struck regions, regions more vulnerable to climate change, but also trying to get mental health services there. These services often belittle, the cultural wisdom that's inherent in those communities already, the resilience that these people have. So I do completely agree, shifting from how we need to tinker with the car to, how to remove the car itself. I think that's really fascinating metaphor as well. But coming to kind of the end of our time together, I just want to finish off on a positive note. How do you think we can cultivate realistic and stable hope? So earlier in the conversation, you mentioned radical hope, which I think the kind of antonym of that is naive hope. So making sure that we let go of naive hope and, actually acknowledge the world as it is, but still trying to foster a sense of optimism. How can we cultivate this in the face of such overwhelming global challenges? And then in this regard, what question or reflection or piece of wisdom, religion, family, or faith would you want to leave with our listeners and young people?
Okay, so I mean, I think radical hope is about, like I said, it's about seeing the reality of things and just seeing what is possible, right? And I think it comes from three sources. So the first source is faith, and in my case, it's faith, spirituality, right? But I'm faith, which if you go through the stories of the Quran, stories of the Prophet, and this is replicated in other stories as well from other faiths as well, that despair is never final, right? Despair is never final, and I think it's important for us to recognize that despair is never final. The second one is, and this is where faith is extremely, which is also good, is the community, which means that we are not alone. Right? We are not alone when we do this. And the third one is that change is possible through action, even if it's small things. And so I think from my perspective, what I would sort of say is, let's start with that honest and courageous conversation around being hopeful for what is possible within our influence. And I'm reminded of the story that I was told a long time ago of the man and the starfish. I don't know if you've come across the story, right? So the man he goes on his morning jog on the beach, and as he sort of comes, he sees millions of starfish have washed ashore overnight, and the sun is coming up, it's drying them, and they're dying, right? And he keeps on running, and he sees an old man in the distance throwing starfish back into the sea. And so he goes to the man and says, "What are you doing?" And the old man says, "Well, I'm throwing starfish back to save them." And the man looks around, the young man looks around and says, "Well, are you crazy? There's millions of starfish here. What possible effect or impact can you have to save them?" And the old man sort of thinks about it and says, "Yeah, you're right. I can't save all of that starfish, but I can save the starfish and he picked up a starfish and he threw it back into the water, right?" And I think that often we need to be saving that starfish, and it actually goes back to spiritual traditions as well, right? Because I think if you look at particularly in the Quran, but also I know it's in the Bible as well, and the Torah, that if you save the life of one person, it's like you saved the life of mankind, right? So that aspect of there's that one person, that one person, and that's the hope, that we can change someone's opinion. We can help them to kind of think differently. We can get them to humanize the other, and I think that's important. And I think maybe my father's sort of what he lived by, I think is probably what I want to leave your listeners with, is that if you can make a difference in someone's life, or help protect the world they live in, then you are already a very wealthy person, right? Because the measure of success is not what we accumulate, but the dignity, the compassion, and the hope we leave behind. And I think that's important. That's important. And so hope is about those small steps.
I think that's really fascinating, that kind of going one step at a time, one starfish at a time, one person at a time. That can really help cultivate hope, because I think often, in the climate movement today, it's, branch out into the national, to the international, to the global one. Not while all those levels are important, it can sometimes make all of our efforts feel meaningless, as in, I can't solve the whole climate crisis, so why should I even try? But, fostering this mindset of taking it one at a time, like I said, starfish at a time, one human at a time, that story, telling it to everybody is really important, because I think a lot of people need to hear that. But
Absolutely. And it goes back to sort of like, go to your local church or your local mosque or your local temple. Okay, what is it that we can do? Like, how can we do things slightly differently, right? I mean, let's not, I'm not expecting people to go solar power and, this thing, but okay, how are you recycling this thing? How are you getting rid of, how are you conserving water? How are you encouraging people, even something as simple as, I was telling a priest the other day, I was like, why don't you, instead of giving water bottles, plastic water bottles to people when they come for your events or whatever, right? I was like, why don't you install a water filter there, right? And get people just to fill it up, And I'm sure actually if you talk to some private sector organization, I'm sure they'll happily donate with their logo, they'll happily donate water bottles that people can use to fill up, right? I mean, these are things that we need to kind of think about, but often I think we become so obsessed with wanting the big brand new shiny thing that we forget the little things. And it's quite interesting, when I was learning about innovation and futures and foresight and everything else, and the person who was sort of doing the training told us a story, and I don't know how true it is. It might not be true, but it was quite a fascinating. He said, like, when NASA spent millions of dollars trying to invent a pen that could work in space in zero gravity, right? The Russians used a pencil. So that story was just shared with us to kind of say, look, innovation is not about the newest, biggest, shiniest thing. It's about the most simplest thing to make things work. And often I think that we we get so caught up in success and wanting these big things to work that perhaps we forget that the simplicity of tasks is what is there. So like I'm saying, let's start with that. Let's start with that with one starfish, and let's work on that. We may not solve the entire issue, but you're starting there, and that helps you then ground your work there. You can then humanize people. You then meet people who you've never met before who share the same passion as you, and that's also important, right? Particularly when you come from different faith groups or ethnic groups, where you suddenly go, hang on, you're from a different group, but we share the same issue. Oh, great! That's a commonality that enables us then to work forward on it. I think that's important. And then let's create those spaces for safe and brave conversations as well, because I think that's important as well, that we don't have spaces where we can talk and we can step back and reflect, because we're always trying to do more and act more, and we don't have the time to reflect. And so one of the things, again, that perhaps I think faith leaders could be good at is creating spaces just to listen. Let's listen to some of the concerns and let people just air them out.
I couldn't agree more. I think, starting local, starting within our own communities, fostering space and conversation is really an amazing way to combat kind of the despair and the hopelessness and the pessimism that comes with eco-anxiety, because we're all just trying to do, the next big shiny thing, like you said, but we haven't really focused on what we can do locally yet. But this was such an interesting conversation. I just want to thank you so much for your time. I think I've learned so much from you, and I think our listeners will as well.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope, I do hope they listen. I mean, I kind of rambled on a little bit, but that's me. You gave me poetic license on this, right? So.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you, Ron.
It's amazing to talk to me.